mentioned how Dr. Roger Leir had kindly donated some of his surgically removed implants to the Phenomena exhibition. But what is it about these implants, but that the makeup of the implants themselves points to an extraterrestrial presence?
Well, I was the one performing the first surgery because it was a foot case, and the general surgeon then acted as my assistant. In doing so, I was the one that did the active probing through the tissues to look for the object, and he, for example, as an assistant does, uses the retractors to hold the wound open and assist me with light and advice. One surprise came during this portion of the surgery when I touched something hard and the patient jerked her foot off the table, came out of the hypnoanesthesia, and just cried out in excruciating pain. This was a very big surprise because just for the anesthesia that I had in the toe alone, she should have felt absolutely nothing. Now, I always look for rational, normal answers to these things, and I felt that one of the things that could have possibly happened was that in touching something, I might have, let's say, pulled on some major nerve trunk that was outside the field of anesthesia. And sometimes that happens, and so although it was a big surprise, it wasn't thoroughly in the realm of impossibility. So though Daryl had reintroduced the hypnoanesthesia, I called for more local, we put in more anesthesia. I was the one with the forceps, as you say, to initially grab the object in its jaws and to get it loosened from the surrounding tissue and removed it. And at that point, the patient also had a rather violent objection and felt discomfort. When I took it out and I put it on a white 4x4 gauze sponge and I looked at it, I was absolutely amazed because I had never seen anything like this in 30-some odd years of surgery. And when you look at the general surgeon's clinical history too, he was just as amazed because he'd never seen anything that looked like that either. The next step was to ascertain as much information that we could from the material at hand. And the material at hand consisted of two types of material. One was the metallic portion of the implant, and one was the biological portion. Then we could say that the biological portion also was subdivided into two portions. The tissue that I had removed that surrounded the area where the implant was in, and the tissue that composed the membrane itself. So our first concern was the tissue that surrounded the implant. That's the first thing that went out for analysis. That's the first thing that I got reports on. That is the first thing that probably pushed me over the edge from a consummate skeptic to a maybe strange.
How so?
Because we found two things in the surgical pathology, came back separately. They were only told, laboratories were only told, that this was soft tissue surrounding a foreign body and the place that it was taken from. The primary concern of a laboratory when receiving a soft tissue specimen today is whether it's malignant or benign. That's their primary interest. And so, first of all, they came back, the tissue was benign. There was nothing there to indicate any kind of malignancy, no tumor-type tissue. Next thing what we found was that the tissue contained no evidence of an inflammatory response. And when I saw this, I read the first report, I said, gee, this is weird, what kind of a fluke is this? And thinking to myself, this lady must be a very strange lady because she doesn't react to inflammation when she gets something in her body. Individual thing, individual anomaly. Strange, but could happen. Then I read the second pathology report, which came back on the gentleman with the object and the hand, and again, in different language, different words, but saying the same thing, no inflammatory response. And I said, wait a minute. Two individuals? Oh, there's something very strange here. Then the second strange thing we found, that in both individuals, these areas were loaded with what are called nerve proprioceptors, little special sensor organs of nerves in tissue where it is not anatomically correct to be. Anatomically, if we look at the body, or we look at the chart, or we look at a copy of Gray's Anatomy, or if you do surgery for 30 years, there's areas in the body where structures are constant. In other words, if you opened up a toe, you would expect to find bone. You would expect to find muscle. You would expect to find some blood supply. You would expect to find some nerve supply. Nerves and specialized nerve tissue run in the areas where they're supposed to be anatomically correct. If you look in a book, this is the training. Most human beings, if we open them up, certain areas of the body, all the anatomical structures will be the same. So that's actually what allows surgery to take place. We don't expect to open a chest and in one individual find the heart 2/3 on the right, 1/3 on the left. It's always 2/3 on the left, 1/3 on the right. The tissues where these objects came out of were sort of a fatty, fibrous, cushioning type of tissue, deep down next to a bone. These are not places where you find specialized end organs for nerves. It was found that if the objects were taken out of the blood serum solution and dried, the membrane became brittle and lost its tensile strength. And then you could take any sharp instrument and cut through it, scrape it off the metal that was within. And when we first did that, we found out that there was 2 pieces of metal that composed the T-shaped object, not one. But it would be impossible to know that as it came out of the body, because you could not move one little metal member on the other. It would not move. It was wrapped so tightly with this membrane structure, one piece of metal would not move upon the other. So that's how we got it off, and that's the next step, was that we took pieces of the membrane and we sent that for analysis. The results of the membrane analysis, again, was one of the many surprises now, one piled upon another, which propelled me into an area that I wound up in today. The membrane was composed of only 3 simple human biological substances. One is called a protein coagulum, which just means that it's protein derived from clotted blood. That's the bulk. And in this bulk, if you look at it under the microscope, you see some brown granules that look like raisins. And these brown granules were subjected to an iron stain, and it came back positive, and it was determined then that these brown granules was a substance called hemosiderin. And hemosiderin is an iron pigment, and it's oxygen-binding pigment, the cousin of which is hemoglobin, which is in the red cells. It's the carrier transport mechanism for oxygen about the body. Then the third and the last thing that we found were strands of keratin. And keratin makes up the outer layer of your skin, makes up your fingernails, toenails, your hair, and the first few layers of the cornea of the eye. And those are the only places you find keratin on the body. Now, there is a pathological situation. In other words, abnormal physiology is pathology. There are abnormal situations where you can find a process occurring in deep tissues of the body called keratinization. In other words, things can be coated with keratin. And we don't know why that occurs, but it's some sort of a genetic anomaly. But this was not keratinization. This was actually keratin strands that were in this membrane. And after learning that, I went into the medical school textbooks at Stanford, Harvard University, George Washington School of Medicine on the computer, and tried to see if there was something listed in the pathology books that I was not aware of, or something that may have been discovered for my 30 years of practice that I did not know. And I was unable to find anything that had ever been removed from the human body that was composed of these 3 substances. And this is a challenge that I put out today, that I make, of course, to anyone in the scientific field is if they think these are mundane objects, then please, please direct me to where I might look into a textbook and see this material somewhere else. I think we might say that the total sum of what I've done so far is do 8 surgeries to date, and that the 8 surgeries have netted us 9 objects. And of the 9 objects, 1 turned out to be an ordinary piece of strange glass that contained sulfur. So that leaves us with 8 objects from 8 surgeries, all which turn out to be very strange. 3 of these 8 objects are little grayish white balls that are attached to an abnormality of the skin. And these were mistaken by a dermatologist in one case to be a lesion called a calcifying epithelioma, saying that the little grayish white ball was a ball of calcium. This was one of the first specimens that went into the National Institute for Discovery Science, and it turned out to have 21 different elements, and none was calcium. The information on the other balls, we are just starting now to get that information in because of the lack of funding and the cost of these tests. Now the other 5 objects are all metal objects and all covered with this very strange membrane. 3 of the 5 objects are little cantaloupe seed shaped affairs, and once the membrane is removed, there's a little metallic rod inside. The other one that was removed from the toe of the lady was a T-shaped object which contained 2 little metallic rods, one butted against the other. And the last one was a metallic triangle that was removed from a gentleman's jaw, also covered with this very strange membrane. Now, the first set of results came because the National Institute for Discovery Science had sent some of these metallic objects to Los Alamos National Labs. Los Alamos did a comprehensive examination with an electron microscope and told us what elements were in the metal rods. And at the end of their report, they merely suggested more research, more tests should be done. At that point, we knew we didn't have an ordinary piece of wood or a twig. We knew that a prestigious laboratory such as Los Alamos would not say go do further testing if they had an ordinary mundane object. So the objects then went back to NIDS, and from NIDS they went out to New Mexico Tech, which is another world-class laboratory, and an entire battery of metallurgical examinations were performed. The results, their conclusion was that these were objects that were most likely samples of meteorites. And they were not told the origin. The laboratories were never told whether these fell off an ostrich's feather or whether it was found on the bottom of the ocean. So we know, without a doubt, since there is no skin abnormalities with metallic objects, no scar, no visible port of entry, we certainly know that the lady did not step on a meteorite and the gentleman didn't whack one with the back of his hand. Finally, to top off the metallurgical testing, tests were run at the University of California, and the researcher there determined that some of the metals, some of the elements in these objects contain non-terrestrial isotopic ratios, which means they don't come from this Earth. By this time, I don't think that I could have had any further surprises that would push me farther over the edge than I already was. This was the icing on the cake. This then meant that we were proposing the most profound question that could absolutely be proposed to mankind, and that is, people who allege alien abduction wind up with objects in their body that contain extraterrestrial isotopic ratios. And therefore, the only conclusion that I could draw was that these people are telling the truth, and this is proof that mankind has been manipulated by extraterrestrials, interdimensionals, some other being